Hello, this is Anna Imagination with the Healing Garden, and this is lab research. It is 16th of December. I am a couple days into, I don't want to call it the 13th perspective. It's equivalent to the 13th perspective, but it's not. It's the first ethical perspective in the U of I. And this is what I refer to as not disorientation, but normalizing. You could say it's normalizing. And it took me a while to realize that what I'm currently going through emotionally is part of the transition, which is why I decided to jump on and do a recording instead of taking this private, is because I was not dealing with just my emotional crap. It was actually part of the 13th perspective. Upon the completion of the 12 perspectives, you basically have the established self. You officially have all 12 parts of the self, the I of I. And when you have the accumulation of the 12, you have love. And as fucking gorgeous and beautiful as math is, as soon as you have all 12 ethics, love births the next triangle in the series. And the next triangle is now the 12 repeated spectrums, perspectives, but this time it's the U of I. So I am officially in part 1 out of 12 in the U of I. And I am a firm believer, like a solid believer, that this is supposed to be experienced at age 12. But we are not experiencing this at age 12. I am currently 43 years old. And as a result, I have a lot of baggage and garbage that I have to cleanse. Now, if you actually experience this at age 12, you don't really have any garbage because you've been raised in the proper order with the proper ethics, laddered, stabilized, and internalized one on top of the other. So I imagine that upon this, you're just at the full self. But in my case, because of the 40 years of abuse, I have purging to do. So I am currently undergoing the mass overall purge, which is causing severe disorientation. And bottom line is, I discovered that I have had narcissism. I have full awareness, and I can see how basically my entire life has been a lie. It is a removal of all false perspectives and mindsets so that I can finally see a very clear picture of the truth, my truth. And that is leading me to ask questions like, who am I? Where am I? Which I already have these answers because I have the 12. So I return to the philosopher's compass. I return to all of my knowledge. I recall the knowing, the belonging, the authority, the naming, and the owning. And I can see where all these definitely, yes, fit into it. But now, and that's when I looked back at the knowing, the belonging, the authority, the naming, and the owning, I realized that there's the next stage. And I would say that the next stage is, well, it would be the purge. And it is basically a summation of the identity. But because the identity has been contaminated, in my case, it is an entirely different step back, assess, and reestablish the self. So one of the things that I am, I don't know, I just have severe disorientation, and it's trying to ground myself. I toggle between emotions of depression, sad, depression, and crying fits like I've lost. That's the grief. It's literally just the stages of grief that I'm going through. And it is a lack of not knowing, just fear, just complete disorientation. I think time is really the only thing I need right now. And I just have to play through it all. I don't trust my emotions. I don't trust love. I have a severe aversion now to love, where more so than ever, because everything that I knew as love, I just see it as a full manipulation and contamination of narcissism. So looking back at my entire life, every instance that I thought was love, I now don't trust it. The desire to run is gone. I have no desire to run away, which is definite. This is the first in my life I don't have a desire to run. It is instead a feeling of not knowing what to do. Just sitting here going, I don't trust my words. I don't trust speaking to people. Whenever I do open my mouth to speak now, I ask the question, are you saying that because you're looking for a desired response to measure his love affection for you? And until I can answer that, honestly, I'm afraid to speak. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to move. I feel like my entire survival, my entire everything that I've done my whole life has been programmed with manipulation. Manipulation is extraordinary in the sense of what we are told it is and what we think it feels like. And this makes so much more sense now, because in the emotional transaction of gifting, and I said this, you have every emotion has 4 pathways. And son of a fucking bitch, I can see it now. You have your non-consensual pathway and you have your consensual pathway. And in addition to that, you can give or you can receive. And manipulation, when you receive it, feels like X, but when you give manipulation, it feels like Z. So we do not recognize manipulation because it has 2 emotional transactions with it. And when we think manipulation, we all always, I'm using quantifiers on this. When we think of manipulation, we all always think about what it feels like to receive manipulation non-consensually. And this is the new emotion I've discovered, is what manipulation feels like when you give it to somebody else, and it feels completely different, which is why we have not been able to identify it. Because manipulation, when you give it to someone, feels entirely different than when you receive it from someone. Understanding, and of course it's non-consensual, so understanding the 2 pathways of every emotion, that there's a feeling associated with it when you receive it, but an entirely different feeling when you give it, which makes it impossible, literally impossible, for us to identify the emotion because it feels something completely different when you give it. Manipulation does not feel like manipulation when it's received as it does when it's given. Manipulation, when it is given, feels like fear. It feels like paranoia. It feels like desperation. It feels like, please don't leave me. That's what it feels like. It feels like, just feels like fear. But when you receive manipulation, it feels like enslavement. It feels like confusion. It feels like control. When you receive manipulation, it feels like alertness. It feels like you're trapped. But giving manipulation feels like sadness, feels like hurt feels like a plea. And this is what I mean by it's the same thing. It's manipulation, but it feels like X when you receive it, and it feels like Z when you give it. So because we have one emotion, one action, but it has two emotions attached to it, the giving emotion and the receiving emotion, it completely alters its characteristics. And because the characteristics are altered, we can't recognize it. So someone will say, and this is why we have a misunderstanding of perspectives. Someone will say, you're manipulating me, because they can feel the receiving of the manipulation. And when they receive it, they will say, you're manipulating me. But then the person who's doing the manipulation will evaluate in a split second and think, well, I'm not enslaving. It doesn't feel like enslavement. It doesn't feel like confusion. It doesn't feel like control. And they'll contradict and say, no, I'm not. And then they'll say, you're gaslighting me. And gaslighting feels like manipulation being received. This makes so much sense. But gaslighting, when it's given, doesn't feel at all like manipulation when it's received. So again, it's that there's that disconnect because we are unaware that there are two sides to every emotion. That an emotion when it's given does not feel like the same emotion when it's received. Love is this way. Love feels a certain way when it's given, and it feels a certain way when it's received. Think about when your cat snuggles you. You feel honored when your cat loves you. You feel like you've received a gift when your cat chooses to love you. You feel special when your cat chooses you. And when you love your cat, you feel happiness. You feel joy. It's a completely different sensation than honored and special, even though it's love, giving and receiving. And understanding that emotions either fall consensual or non-consensual. Knowing that they fall also in the sense of a giving and a receiving, and that there are characteristics for each emotion depending upon which side of it falls on, allows you to identify which emotion you are practicing. And this is like the core to understanding narcissism, manipulation, abuse, because we have been looking at all of this through one dimension. And this is the problem. This is the core of what leads us to misunderstanding. Now, in addition to that, this is all about language, because when you have language like this, you have your 12 perspectives. In addition to having the 12 perspectives, let's just take English, American English as an example. You have American English, but you have 12 perspectives within that. Now, in addition to the 12 perspectives, you also have the giving and the receiving. And then you have also the regions. So somebody who lives in Brooklyn, New York is not going to be using the same verbiage as somebody who lives in Ohio, even though they are of the same perspective. I was speaking to somebody yesterday, and she lives in Philadelphia, and I live in New York. We had completely different verbiage. And we realized that it took us 30 minutes to learn each other's language. Now, within this 30 minutes, there was tension, there was prejudice, there was frustration, and I had an urge I realized I wanted to run away because I felt judged. And while I was there talking with her, I felt that she was on her path, I was on mine, that we were going to unite, but not yet. And I felt that there was absolutely nothing productive that could result from that conversation. And when I attempted to terminate the conversation, she paused me there and said, "Why are you withdrawing?" And I said, I feel judged. I just feel judged. I feel like we definitely have something that we're on our own front and that we will come together, but we definitely have our own missions. And where we were struggling was our authority. We were both authorities, and we did not realize at what level. So we could not determine who was at the advantage or the disadvantage. So the 30-minute of conversation was spent with us exploring each other, trying to figure out who was top dog, who had the authority. It took us 30 minutes to realize we were equals. Now, for me, that was the first time I had really, truly met an equal, somebody who could see everything that I could see. She was spot on. It was extraordinary. And she could see everything that she could see. In addition to that, she was the first 12th perspective I'd met. And in addition to being a 12th perspective and being able to explain everything, she had different resources, different stories. I had my stories. So when we started comparing stories, we realized that we were saying the same thing, but we were using different words to communicate it. Once that happened, so it was in establishing that we were equals, realizing that neither one of us could be teacher. We both had to be teacher and student, but mostly we were both, it was suddenly a comparison. Whereas prior to that, it was teacher or student or teacher. This was a comparison. Completely changed everything. And it made us both realize, or at least it made me realize, that going forward, I have to make sure that I enter into the equal comparison first, and then determining, do they know what I know? Is this going to be where I teach them, or am I their student? Where is everything? So it was a trying to figure out who was the authority. And then it was realizing that we were both authorities and we were equal to each other. And then it was comparison. And then we could enter into the let's now learn each other's language and translate. And the rest of the conversation turned into a let's translate each other's language. And when we realized that we were translating each other's language, we realized that we were just speaking different languages. But in order to get to this level, we had to sacrifice ego. We had to give up a lot of different things. And it's understanding that every emotion has a non-consensual side and a consensual side, but also every emotion has a giving and a receiving. So one emotion can have 4 different characteristics, emotional characteristics. And because of these language barriers, because of this, us not knowing this, what we are looking at in our society is a significant emotional or language barrier that is resulting in so much miscommunication. Now, furthermore, there's also a lot of language inside of our culture that is placed there on purpose to persuade us to think a certain way. I call these shrinking words or growing words. And most growing words are banned God words. Words that if we try to use them or gravitate toward them, somebody puts us in check to make sure we stay small and we stay shrinking. So there's also a taboo of words that were not to be used. Other words like humble and humility or supermom, these are shrinking words that are glorified. We are rewarded for shrinking in these cases. And whereas pride is something that is people use shame to keep you down. So in those cases, we have words where the words in our culture has been used so poorly as a form of manipulation without us being aware of it. So you have the manipulation of our words in our culture. You also have the lack of understanding the emotional characteristics of both sides of an emotion, that it has the giving feeling and the emotion and the receiving emotion. So once you start to understand the depth in which language is absolutely being used as intentionally and on purpose in both cases. Sometimes it's on purpose, sometimes it's quite unintentional, and we have no idea. This is just a combination of ignorance in some cases and being deliberate on other cases, where as a result, there is a massive miscommunication happening. And in order to resolve this miscommunication, what needs to happen is basically returning to the basics. And this is where it is important to understand that words come from emotions. So when you go back to the basics and you return to the emotional state and you use small, and I do mean EB white level words, to depict and explain and extract emotional status, that is where the words then evolve and develop so that you have a better control over what it is you need to say. So when there's definite miscommunication happening, it's always best to go back to just describing very EB white basics, your emotions. This is how I feel. And that is where you meet in the plane of understanding, is going back to those emotions and then understanding that the emotion feels one way when you give it, but it does feel a different way when you receive it, like in the case of manipulation, which is why narcissism has been so difficult to identify, is because narcissism feels like X going out, but it feels like Y coming in. So everyone assumes that narcissism is X. I'm sorry, that narcissism is Y, the feeling of receiving narcissism. And that is not true. Narcissism feels like Y when it's received, but it feels like X when it's given. And understanding the two sides of the emotions is going to really allow us to step back, understand this give and take exchange, so we can better identify narcissism, all of these different emotions. Gaslighting is a phenomenal example because it feels like X going out, manipulation, but it feels like Y coming in. Completely different emotions. So understanding the emotional characteristics is going to be a huge tool and helping us understand that what we feel on our end is not what is being received on their end. Even when we give a gift, this is a great example. When you give someone a gift on Christmas, the receiving of the gift feels completely different than the giving of the gift, which is why people will differentiate, I love giving over receiving. And other people will say, I prefer receiving to giving. It's that preference, because even though it's still giving, there is definitely a difference. And that is precisely the same thing that's going on with our emotions. So thank you so much for your audience, and may the kindest of words always find you.